Welcome to King's College London, and to what I'm reliably informed is the 12th Mark Sainsbury lecture, it having begun in 2009. This lecture is one of the ways that we tried to keep Mark attached to the department. And I'm very glad to see that it absolutely works, because here he is. And we've managed actually to keep this going all that time. As I was explaining earlier on, this is in honour of what Mark did to the department when he was here, what he was to the department, and as I said earlier, he's the father of the department in all sorts of rich and important ways. So this is for thank you to Mark. To give the Mark Sainsbury lecture this year, it's a complete honour and privilege to introduce Dorothy Edgington to you, who is just extraordinary. And I can say that without fear of disagreement, because I can't do the things that she can do, so I can just admire them from a long way away. She's a very, very distinguished philosopher, London philosopher, Oxford philosopher. I would very much recommend, so she's got a festschrift that just came out, which I wrote down what the name was, but it's edited by Lee Walters and John Hawthorne, and she has a brilliant essay in it called Philosophy and Me, which a title blows me away anyway, but it's a wonderful discussion about how she wasn't really going to be a philosopher, she was going to do something else, and then she was going to do some other something else, and then she was going to do some other. And it's rather, as Aristotle would say, katasumba berkos, that she ended up being a philosopher at all. That she is such a distinguished philosopher is maybe a testament to that way of going about doing things. She was at Birkbeck from 1968 to 1996, I think, when she went to Oxford for a short break, and then she was enticed there for a longer, well, it wasn't longer technically, but for a more formal post when she was the Waynflete Chair in Oxford, of philosophy in Oxford. A lot of remarks are made about how she was the first woman philosophy professor in Oxford, about which hooray, hooray, but she was already in London. Yeah, fair. If you look at her list of publications, it completely justifies the claim that is regularly made by philosophers, that philosophers often don't write books, but do the most stunning work in articles, in Dorothy's case, on all sorts of really difficult things like the paradox of nobility and counterfactuals and vagueness, which started, of course, with the Greeks, so that's okay. So it's a huge privilege to introduce Dorothy, who's going to speak about two kinds of indeterminacy. Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you very much for those very generous remarks. Well, it's a great pleasure to be giving the Mark Sainsbury lecture this rather special year, where it's part of a two-day event in Mark's honour. Mark and I were colleagues in London from 1978, when he arrived at Bedford College, until around 2002, when he left Kings for Texas. Is this working okay? Is people hearing me? Down a bit, like that. Get a bit closer. We were not at the same college, but we were colleagues. There was close cooperation between the philosophy departments of UCL, King's, Birkbeck, and in the early days, Bedford, at all levels. There were intercollegiate lectures, intercollegiate exams, and the philosophers met regularly, both for administrative purposes and to discuss philosophy. There was the London Philosophy Group, which met weekly in what was then Richard Volheim's office in UCL, and it was there that I first met Mark, who gave a talk soon after arriving at Bedford. I don't recall too much about the content, though I think it was about reference. I do recall registering how tall he was. There was low, comfortable sofa seating in this room, and he wrote so high up on the blackboard that I had to crane my neck to see it. The intercollegiate nature of London philosophy provided the strong argument championed by Mark that Bedford's philosophy department should join King's when Bedford College as a whole merged with Royal Holloway and moved out to Egham. Thereafter, he played a huge role in the enlarged King's department, and I've heard so many ex-students and ex-colleagues speak of him with great love, really. Mark's inaugural lecture, given in 1990, when he became Susan Stebbing Professor of Philosophy at King's, Concepts Without Boundaries, was one of the loveliest and most enjoyable lectures I have ever attended. He's discussed the problem of vagueness in many other articles and in a chapter of his delightful book, Paradoxes. The problem of vagueness is one of my topics tonight. The other is a kind of indeterminacy involved in counterfactual thinking about what would have happened if. These are on the face of it, and they are two quite different kinds of indeterminacy, but I argue that a common structure helps us to understand both these kinds. And at the end, I suggest that there are other links beyond the structure, ways in which counterfactual indeterminacy may illuminate vagueness. I shall say now that the slides are few and far between. Just occasionally I thought they might be a bit helpful, but you won't be getting slides all the time. Okay, we'll start with vagueness. Think of the colour spectrum spread out before you. You can identify the different colours with ease, but if asked to identify the point at which one colour ends and the next begins, you're at a loss. One colour just shades gradually into the next. This is an illustration of the vagueness which infects a great many of our concepts: old, child, rich, intelligent, wicked, risky, a case for such and such legal verdict or medical treatment. There are cases where the concepts clearly apply and clearly fail to apply, and there are cases where it's not clear whether or not they apply. Of course, many of these terms are context dependent. Tall in the context of a basketball team differs from tall in the context of a kindergarten. But it's hard to see how an appeal to context makes the problem of vagueness go away. In a fixed context, there still seems to be no cut-off point. This causes problems. You're casting for a play and need a tall man for a part. It's hard to deny that if X will do for height and Y is 1 millimetre shorter, then Y will do for height. But iteration of this thought leads to an absurd conclusion. If 1 millimetre never makes a significant difference, then anyone, however small, will do for height. This is the Sorites paradox from the Greek word soros, which means a heap. Take one grain away from a heap and you still have a heap. Same problem. It's not just a philosopher's problem, but something that causes problems in real life. I once heard someone say on the radio in a discussion of whether it ought to be illegal for parents to smack their children. There's all the difference in the world between a cautionary tap on the wrist and a vicious beating. So, granting a little hyperbole, there is, but a series of actions, each insignificantly different from its predecessor, can take us from one to the other. Where to draw the line? So we all face problems of this structure. We can be seduced by Sorites sequences, whether the seducer is ourselves or another. That's what I call the mañana paradox, the unwelcome task that needs to be done, but I can always convince myself that it's a matter of indifference whether it's done today or tomorrow. Or one chocolate won't make any significant difference to my weight. One technique for corrupting a politician, I heard in a lecture about the mafia, actually, is to begin with an innocuous gift, such as chocolates on his birthday, and move in very small steps from there until you have him in the palm of your hand. Much of the time, though, vagueness doesn't bother us unduly. We competently perform countless tasks based on judgments involving vague concepts. Pick the raspberries when they're red. Walk a little more slowly. There's not enough coffee for a full pot. Fill it to about 3/4 full. Despite the lack of sharp cut-off points, we usually have no difficulty in complying. I think I'll try standing, actually. I might feel that's better.
I'd like to put it on something.
That's all right. It's all right. From the perspective of classical logic and the accompanying semantics, it's a defect of natural language. No, I think I'll change my mind. I'll go down again. For many predicates, that there are objects to which they neither clearly apply nor clearly fail to apply. In the type of ideal language dealt with by Frege, Russell, and others, this doesn't happen. The idealization is fine when we're not troubled by borderline cases, and that is most of the time. I'm not suggesting we jettison the idealization, but it doesn't help us to understand how vague language and thought work, what we can and can't do with it. Okay. Right. It's worth remembering that the primary purpose of the logic and theory of language developed by Frege and Russell was to have a logic adequate for mathematical reasoning. Mathematics is the area of precision. Should we really try to reform language, as Frege suggested, so that it conforms with the ideal of precision? How would we go about it? We could try to stipulate sharp boundaries for our predicates between red and orange, for example. But this conflicts with another ideal. A language should not make arbitrary, pointless distinctions. The difference between truth and falsity should be a difference that matters. As Dummett said, it's part of the purpose of the concept of childhood that one doesn't cease to be a child at an instant, but gradually becomes an adult. Admittedly, for some purposes, an arbitrary line is better than no clear line. For instance, in the law, there is arguably a case for trying to stipulate sharp boundaries, but there's a cost, even if it's the lesser evil. There's a feeling of arbitrariness and injustice about the resultant fact that almost indistinguishable cases may be treated in a radically different manner. For instance, two youngsters in some mischief, almost the same age, one just over 18, one just under 18. It's a matter of dispute among legal theorists how much the law should aim at the elimination of vagueness and how much it should rely on judges and juries for how the law should apply in tricky cases. The elimination strategy can be taken to great extremes. Someone writing on this mentioned a Canadian bylaw about the shooting of frogs. The idea was it's okay to shoot frogs, but not the young, hence small ones. The bylaw states that it's forbidden to shoot frogs whose tibia is less than 2.5 centimeters long. They didn't actually say what if one was over and one tibia was over and one was under. I was passing a pub the other day with a meals menu outside, and that reminded me that at some time in lockdown, pubs could be open only if they served meals. This led to controversies about what was the minimum that counted as a meal. Crisps, peanuts? No. But what about a Scotch egg? Did that count as a meal? And of course, there's the ongoing issue about whether certain events were or were not parties. Would an ideal language simply not have these vague words, not speak of being tall or short, for example, but instead speak of them being, e.g., 6 foot 2 inches in height? While the more precise vocabulary is indeed obviously superior for certain purposes, the opposite is also true. It takes more time, effort, equipment and opportunity to judge that someone's height is 6 feet 2 inches than it does to judge that they're tall. The latter judgment is easier to remember and communicate. A witness of a crime may well say the assailant was tall, but is unlikely to be more specific. And often we simply don't have the precise vocabulary. What would we substitute for the judgment that someone is angry or left-wing? When the more precise vocabulary is available, vagueness is reduced, but strictly speaking, not eliminated. Tall is vague. 6 feet 2 inches is considerably less vague, but understood in a way in which we're capable of applying it, it's understood as applying within a certain degree of approximation, and there's no sharp boundary to approximately 6 feet 2 inches. It's doubtful whether there is such a thing as being exactly 6 foot 2, even at an instant, let alone across time. What about loose hairs, loose skin, the exact orientation of the spine? It's hard to think of any empirical predicate which we're capable of applying for which it's not conceivable that it admits of borderline cases, though, of course, what we think of as precise terms are precise enough for practical purposes. So there is no getting rid of vagueness. There ought to be something positive and constructive to say about reasoning with vague concepts. We learn many concepts, both in everyday life and in particular areas of expertise, by familiarity with paradigms, clear textbook cases for a given treatment or verdict, say. We go on to face situations relevantly different to some extent from these clear textbook cases. The judgment that this is at least close to a clear case for a given treatment or verdict should be of some value to us. Our question then is how to reason in vague languages, how to avoid the pitfall of the Socrates and yet put vague judgments to some legitimate use. Mark, in his inaugural lecture, in his attempt to eliminate talk of boundaries, puts forward this image. Point.
You want me to do them? Swapping them out.
If you really want, but it doesn't really. Okay, there aren't many.
Then you
yes.
can just
okay.
go. Next slide.
Okay, next slide.
Archaeologists.
Yes. We could think of concepts as like magnetic poles exerting various degrees of influence. Some objects cluster firmly to one pole, some to another pole. The poles could be red and orange, say. And some, though sensitive to the forces, join no cluster. Well, I really like the image of poles exerting various degrees of influence. But the last part of the remark, some join no cluster, though true, misses out, to my mind, an important fact that amongst those that join no cluster, some are closer to a pole than others are. Some have a stronger pull in one direction than others. It doesn't entail, what Mark says doesn't entail, but suggests that the important division is threefold. But what drives the Socrates is that many tiny differences mount up. And in my view, we need to theorize in terms of degree of closeness to clear cases. What led me to this view of vagueness was an analogy between deduction from premises which are close to clearly true but not quite clearly true, and deduction from premises which are close to certain but not quite certain. A pitfall the latter must avoid is the lottery paradox, and that is structurally similar. to the Sorites paradox. So let us look briefly at the lottery. To believe something is not necessarily to be absolutely certain it's true. It's enough to be close to certain. I believe Anne will be there, but I'm not absolutely certain she will, is not a contradiction. On this conception of belief, the lottery paradox shows the following to be untenable. Okay, next slide. That's it. What is shown to be untenable is that if you have a recognizably valid argument and you believe all the premises, it would be inconsistent to believe that the conclusion is false. I've put recognizably there because I'm just setting aside arguments which are too hard for us to take in. And so from henceforth, whenever I say valid argument, I mean an argument that that is recognizably valid. So there are, say, 100 tickets numbered 1 to 100. Someone is to shake the bag, put in her hand, and select the winning ticket. You believe ticket 1 won't win, ticket 2 won't win, ... all of them. Ticket 100 won't win. It follows from all these premises that none of the tickets will win, but you don't believe that. You believe it's false that none of the tickets will win. Of the same ilk as the lottery is the paradox of the preface, the author of a history book who says in the preface that although she's checked her facts very carefully, she's sure an error must have slipped in somewhere. She doesn't believe that they're all true. And we don't really need the preface to make that point. We should all admit that we're bound to have some false beliefs. It would be really bad if we are forced to conclude that deduction is useless when your premises fall short of certainty by however small an amount. For instance, you get a message saying that because the usual lecturer is ill, this week's lecture will be given by either Dullard or Bright. Later, you acquire strong evidence that it won't be Bright. Bright has arranged another meeting with someone else at the time. You infer that it's Dullard who is giving the lecture and maybe decide not to bother to go. Your premises are close to certain, but not quite certain. Does the lottery paradox show you're wrong to be confident in your conclusion? Well, to solve this puzzle, we need a more fine-grained description of epistemic attitudes than the coarse-grained belief, disbelieve, neither. We need to operate with degrees of closeness to certainty. This isn't just because of this puzzle. It's needed to understand non-conclusive evidence, and it's needed to understand decision-making under uncertainty. Idealizing, we represent the degree of closeness to certainty of a judgment by a number between 1 for completely certain, 0 for certainty that it's false. The nearer to 1, the nearer to certainty. Following well-established practice, these degrees of closeness to certainty should obey, these idealized degrees of closeness to certainty should obey the laws of probability. Degree of closeness to certainty is one kind of probability. Now, there's a useful result, or in fact two. I think we're for the next slide now. I say there are two equivalent results. The first result, the uncertainty of it can be proved quite easily that the uncertainty of a conclusion can't exceed the sum of the uncertainties of the premises. That is, many small possibilities of error can add up to a large, even a maximal possibility of error. And an equivalent form of the result, which I'll be talking more about because it's easier to display. Take two statements, A and B. Anne will be there, Bill will be there, and now consider their conjunction, A and B. So the maximum uncertainty of A and B is the uncertainty of A plus the uncertainty of B. First, of course, this is a special case. 2 is a special case of 1 because A, B, so A and B is a valid argument. But second, it's equivalent to 1, because a many-premise argument is exactly equivalent to a one-premise argument with all the premises conjoined by ands. So now I come to a little demonstration of the second result. Right. Originally this was meant to be a matchbox, but it wouldn't have been big enough, so it's a board. The board is of length 1. We have 2 sticks. They're of length 0.9. A is of length 0.9 and B is of length 0.8. You have to put the sticks vertically onto the board in such a way that put them the overlap between A and B is minimal. Well, think about it. If you added 0.9 and 0.8 together, you get 1.7, but they have to fit into a board of length 1, so the overlap must be at least 0.7. So there is a picture of, if A is 0.9 and B is 0.8, the minimal overlap is 0.7. The uncertainty is 0.3, 1 up here and 2 down here. That is an instant of it. That's the most important part of it, but the maximum overlap is like that, 0.8. The smaller match, and the intermediate one, or many intermediate ones, but that's an intermediate one. There it's about 0.75 or something like that. When you look at the intermediate one, you see that we really have the 4 possibilities. This bit is not A and not B. This bit is B and not A. This bit is A and B. This bit is A and not B. In the maximum, and those must sum to 1 by logic, and so that's just the general thing. In both the maximum and the minimal case, you've put something to 0. If it's the maximum overlap, you've put not A and not B. No, you've put B and not A to 0. In the minimal case, you've put not A and not B to 0. There's none of it that is not A and not B, because you've got not A up here and not B here. But the important one is recognizing the minimal. The worst case is worst case for A and B. If you've got A 0.9 and B 0.8 is 0.7, and that's just an illustration of that thing. Yeah. Note that note that A and B is not fixed by A and B. But it does set limits to it. Where are we? And it's surely common sense that the uncertainties in a large number of premises can add up and destroy the value of the conclusion. In the little argument about dullard and bright, if you judge both premises to be around 95% probable, the worst case scenario for the conclusion is 90% probable. That's not at all bad. But for the lottery, 100 premises, each 99% probable, is compatible with the conclusion being 0% probable, as it is in this case. And you can see the things going down that way for the lottery paradox. Ticket 1 won't win 99%. Ticket 1 and ticket 2 won't win 98%. Ticket 1, 2, 3, 97%. It'll go all the way down to 0. So that's a solution if we about how you can, in many circumstances, use deduction from uncertain premises and not do too badly. they will still transmit a high probability to the conclusion, though it may be, it can often be lower than either premise. But with a very large number of slightly uncertain premises, the uncertainty mounts up, and the conclusion can be certainly false. Okay, enough of lotteries. There was something else I wanted to say. I think I wanted to say yes. Okay, the numbers are an idealization. The take-home message in qualitative terms is that a small number of highly probable premises does transmit a high probability to the conclusion. But I said the rest. But think about it. The numbers are an idealization, but it is the numbers that dug out the structure that the sum of the uncertainties of the premises can transmit to the conclusion. Okay. So some time ago, in fact, at least a bit more than 25 years ago, I think, I argued that the same structure can be used to understand reasoning in vague languages. An idealized model will represent the degree to which a judgment is close to clearly true by a number, 1 for clearly true, 0 for clearly false. The closer to 1, the closer to clearly true. It's an idealization, just as using numbers in degrees of closeness to certainty is an idealization. Typically, there are no uniquely correct numbers to assign. It's a precise model of an imprecise phenomenon. The orthodox true-false classification is also a precise model of an imprecise phenomenon, but the many-valued model is a more helpful one when vagueness is at issue. Because it is an idealization, worthwhile results from this framework must be robust enough to be independent of small numerical differences, which may be without real significance. In the sorites, as in the lottery, you have a large number of premises, each at least very close to clearly true. If this guy's tall, this guy's tall. If this guy's tall, that's it, and so on. These two are so close that it's very, but it's going down. It's going downhill, but it's very close to clearly true that if he's tall, he's taller, and so on. If there are 100 such premises which receive, say, 0.99, the conclusion can get 0 and be clearly false. On the other hand, you can, with due caution, rely on valid arguments whose premises are at least close to clearly true, provided there are not too many such premises. For instance, Jones is a case for treatment X. If Jones is a case for treatment X, so is Smith. So Smith is a case for treatment X. If each premise gets at least 0.99, the conclusion gets at least 0.98, and that's pretty good. But iterating the argument many times can take you from a clearly true starting premise to a clearly false conclusion. So the lesson of the sorites is that a large number of individually insignificant departures from clear truth can lead, by valid reasoning, to a maximal departure from clear truth. Now, I think I'm going to skip a little bit. I was going to show that in the vagueness case as well, the value to be assigned to A and B is not a function of the value to be assigned to A and the value assigned to B, as in the other case. I think I'm going to skip that and move to my second topic. Okay, there may be a lingering doubt about whether vagueness is a suitable subject for the application of probabilistic structure, which is what I've been advocating. Doesn't probability presuppose that there is a fact of the matter? Well, I turn to my second topic, which is counterfactual indeterminacy. With vagueness, the indeterminacy is pretty intuitive, but the probabilistic structure can seem far from obvious. With counterfactuals, it's rather the other way round. The probabilistic structure is pretty intuitive, but it's easy to overlook the indeterminacy. And so this is a different subject, though later on, towards the end, I'll explore some links between these two kinds of indeterminacy. So I'm going to argue that conditionals whose antecedents turn out to be false, not always, but often are not merely uncertain, but indeterminate, neither determinately true nor determinately false. Nevertheless, the probabilities we assign to them are in good order. And here are some examples. Okay, the first example. We've got a bag of coloured balls. 90% of the red balls have a black spot. You'd shake the bag, put your hand in, and select a ball. It's 90% likely that if you pick a red ball, it will have a black spot. In fact, the ball you pick is not red. It's 90% likely that if you had picked a red ball, it would have had a black spot. Okay, I think we go too forward because I've missed out that one. Okay, one more click, yes. So that's the first one. That's just so you remember the example, that's all. So this probability judgment is surely correct. But there is, in general, no determinate fact as to which red ball you would have picked if you'd picked a red ball. This is so whether or not our world obeys deterministic laws. If some indeterminism is involved in the picking of balls, the result is obvious. But assuming our world goes by deterministic laws is no help. If determinism governs the case, the past and the laws determine that you do not pick a red ball. Given the laws and the facts, you couldn't have picked a red ball if we live in a deterministic world. The laws and the facts say nothing about which red ball you would have picked had you done so. Here we have a probability, it's perfectly good, 90% likely that if you'd picked a red ball it would have a black spot without an outcome. Why did I say in general? There'll be the odd exception to this indeterminacy. An odd exception would be when your hand hovers over two balls such that if you hadn't picked one you would have picked the other, and the other was red. We're unlikely to know whether the ball you nearly picked but didn't was a red ball or whether it had a black spot. But in this special case, you have mere ignorance, not indeterminacy. In the general case, in which there's no fact about which ball you would have picked if you hadn't picked this one, you do have indeterminacy. David Lewis realized that under the assumption of determinism, we need a violation of the laws of our world to get the antecedent true. The alternative, keeping the laws the same, would be to change the facts all the way back to the Big Bang, and who knows what the world would be like today. Rather, we normally keep the past fixed until your hand goes in when making the counterfactual supposition that I had picked a red ball. So two more examples that are really just the same. A dog almost always, but not quite always, attacks and bites when strangers approach. We can't tell the difference between the cases in which it does and the few cases in which it does not. It's very likely that you'll be bitten if you approach, I'm told. I don't approach. It's very likely that I would have been bitten if I had approached. Okay, the next one goes, yes. I say. So to make it difficult, again, if there's some indeterminism, there's no problem, but assume determinism, we can distinguish two kinds of case. The first case, whether or not the dog bites, is determined by some standing feature of the situation, but we haven't figured this out. Maybe it doesn't bite if the person approaching has an exceptionally long-pointed nose. Maybe it doesn't bite when it has had an exceptionally large meal, just had an exceptionally large. In that case, the uncertainty is mere ignorance. But the second case, whether or not the dog bites depends on very fine details of the manner of approach, and there's no determinate fact about how exactly down to this level of detail I would have approached had I done so. In this case, even under determinism, we have not mere uncertainty, but indeterminacy. The probability judgment is in order either way. And we don't really care very much about the distinction. It's a metaphysical distinction, but in practice it doesn't affect us very much. Third example. It's about 90% likely that you'll be cured if you have the operation, I'm told. I decline the operation. It's about 90% likely that you would have been cured if you'd had the operation, I'm told later. And so that can go, yes, that's the third one. Again, we can distinguish two scenarios. First, the uncertainty is due to some feature of the present state of my body, which can't be discovered until I'm opened up. This is the case of mere uncertainty. Second, the uncertainty depends, at least in part, on very fine details of the hand movements and cuts the surgeon would have made had I gone ahead. And there's nothing in reality to say at this level of detail exactly what they would have been. In this case, we have not mere uncertainty, but indeterminacy. And this metaphysical difference has no difference on the probability judgments. So as we've seen, there are various sources of indeterminacy. Indeterminism is one, but even under determinism, our ordinary antecedents can typically be realized in many ways. Which red ball would I have picked? How exactly would I have approached the dog? Exactly what would the surgeon's hand movements have been? And the outcome depends on fine details not specified in these ordinary antecedents. Nothing in the real world determines them. On the other hand, when the antecedent together with the present state of the world is a sufficient condition for the truth or falsity of the consequent, given the antecedent, the conditional can be determinately true or determinately false, although we may be ignorant of these facts. One final example. Yes, you can go, I think. A lottery is called off at the last minute because of an emergency. Had it gone ahead, one of the tickets would have won. Each individual ticket would very probably have lost, but there's no determinate fact about which ticket would have won. Had it gone ahead, the world would have been this way or this way or this way or this way, but it's indeterminate which. Now, this counterfactual indeterminacy is, to my mind, similar in structure to the indeterminacy brought about by vagueness. And I'm going to illustrate this with another, a rather vicious version of the Sorites paradox, which is due to Sorensen. So I think we'll have that, yes. 1 second after noon is noonish. 10,000 seconds after noon is not noonish, it's after 2:30 p.m. Therefore, it's not the case that for all n, if n seconds after noon is noonish, n plus 1 seconds after noon is noonish. Therefore, for some n seconds after noon is noonish, and n plus 1 seconds after noon is not noonish. That is, there is a last noonish second. And I say, yes, some second is the last noonish second, but it's indeterminate which the last noonish second is, and that is very similar to one of the tickets would have won, in this cancelled lottery, one of the tickets would have won, the world would have been this way or this way and this way, but it's indeterminate which. And I do say a little bit more about that just here. Had the counterfactual case, the lottery case, had the lottery gone ahead, it's not the case that every ticket would have lost. Some ticket would have won. Not because there's a ticket that definitely would have won, but because each ticket had a small chance of winning. In the vagueness case, look at 1 there, it's not the case that for all n, if n seconds after noon is noonish, n plus 1 seconds after noon is noonish. Not because there's a definite last noonish second, but because enough of its instances fall slightly short of clear truth. All these, if n seconds after noon is n plus 1, are very slightly tiny difference from clear truth for their conjunction to be clearly false. And again, the same thing really with 2. Some ticket is the last noonish second, not because there's a definite last noonish second. All instances of n is noonish and n plus 1 is not noonish get at most a very, very low value, but there are enough of them for their disjunction, either this to be clearly true. Speaking metaphorically, many, many seconds have a, scare quotes, chance of being the last noonish second, but it's indeterminate which is the last noonish second. Now, okay, now I have a little interlude that I thought I would mention. You can go to the next slide. Oh no, that one, yes. Those who deny counterfactual indeterminacy are sometimes called Molinists, after the 16th century Spanish Jesuit Luis de Molina, according to whom God knows exactly what would have happened in any counterfactual situation. He called this kind of knowledge scientia media, or middle knowledge, to distinguish it from the 2 forms of knowledge we have from Aquinas, which would be, roughly speaking, necessary truths and contingent truths. And it was at the heart of his attempt to reconcile free will with God's foreknowledge, and it was always controversial. I gather, there may be people here who know more about this than me, that he was more on the free will side, and so God didn't necessarily know beforehand what a person is going to do, but at least his foreknowledge was of all the possible consequences of whatever they do. And it was always controversial. It was one, well, amongst, it seems to have been popular with Jesuits and not with other Catholic philosophical theologians. In the introduction to volume 2 of her collected papers, Elizabeth Anscombe writes about how she was getting interested in philosophy first, which related to her converting as a teenager to Catholicism. And she was reading a book called Natural Theology by a 19th century Jesuit and came across this Molinism. I found I could not believe this doctrine, she says. It appeared to me that there was not quite generally any such thing as how someone would have spent their life if they had not died as a child, for instance. Later, she was in Oxford by then, she was being instructed by a Dominican, and he asked if she had any difficulties, and she told him about this and said, I couldn't see how that stuff could be true. He was a bit amused, and he told her she certainly didn't have to believe that doctrine, the Dominicans being on the other side of a 300-year dispute, so she could become a Catholic after all. And I'm on Anscombe's side that there's nothing in reality to determine, e.g., which red ball I would have picked if I'd picked a red ball, but the probabilities are in order. There are some contemporary secular Molinists in the sense of thinking that any counterfactual, there is a fact of the matter about exactly how things would have gone if I'd picked another ball or had the operation and so on. I used to argue with Hugh Mellor about it. He would say, but there's only one way the world would have been had this happened. And I would say, yes, but it's indeterminate what that one way is. and he wasn't at all pleased to be associated with 16th century Jesuit doctrine. I think others have a deep-seated prejudice about probabilities without outcomes, and I think this is a mistake. But I think that's part of what the. I mean, I might have included some, but I only got yesterday a paper by Alan Hayek called Counterfacts, and he names many contemporary philosophers who he thinks do have this Molinist sort of doctrine. I think it's a mistake. I say, think of the garden of forking paths, and now I have a slide for which I apologize. You can do it. But if they're really paths, they're allowed to be a bit wiggly and so on. But anyway, my point is that this is a very standard way of exhibiting some kinds of probabilistic structure. If you go to get to this point, you'll have a 0.5 chance of getting to this point, and so on. The double line shows the way you actually went, but the probabilities on the other paths are still there, and it's. It can be, as I say, literally or metaphorically. It can be a garden of forking paths, and so you went that way, and then you say, or someone else says, well, if you'd gone left there, you would have had a 0.5 chance of reaching X, which is the spot you were aiming for, the treasure or whatever it is. I think it's a mistake to think that just because you didn't go that way, those probabilities have somehow disappeared. Okay. I think I have a blank one next, do I? That's fine. I didn't want people looking at that awful thing for too long. If I'm right about counterfactual indeterminacy, that supports the idea that there's nothing untoward about using probabilistic structure for vagueness too. Indeterminacy and probability can be friends, can be bedfellows. But I think there's more to be said about the connection between the two kinds of indeterminacy, or these two kinds of indeterminacy. First point I'll make is that sometimes counterfactual indeterminacy is our source of vagueness. Consider being rich in the material sense. Now, this is a favorite of philosophers writing on the Socrates. Someone with £1 million, i.e. 100 million pence, is rich. If someone with X pence is rich, someone with X minus 1 pence is rich. And off we go down the slippery slope. They write as though it's a precise matter how many pounds and pence a person has, but it isn't. Most people, especially candidates for being rich, have some non-monetary assets. Houses, land, cars, jewellery, businesses, paintings, laptops, mobile phones, etc. When these things are not being sold, it's not determinate exactly what these things would sell for if they were being sold today. Hence, there's no determined fact about exactly how someone's wealth translates into pounds and pence. Of course, there's a ballpark figure, but nothing perfectly exact. I heard of an estate agent who said, pricing is like fly fishing. You cast your line and see what comes along. Talking in terms of pounds and pence instead of just rich doesn't eliminate vagueness, and I made the same point with tall earlier on. Now a more general point. Out of context, you might shrug your shoulders and wonder why anyone should care about the line between red and orange, etc. But as I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes an on-off, yes-no sort of action is called for at some point on a sliding scale. It may be a legal case or a case of medical treatment or even the picking of a raspberry. Is it red enough? Is this parental behavior sufficiently bad to take a child into care? Or is the law to be interpreted in such a way that a Scotch egg counts as a meal? If the pressure's too high or the temperature's too high, the machine is in a dangerous state and must be switched off. Well, how high is too high? The machine typically doesn't switch from safe to dangerous in a sudden matter as a result of a tiny difference. One more example. There's a competition for the best time climbing 2 mountains over a certain height in a certain area, starting and ending on a public road. Thinking about which peaks to tackle, you come across a difficult case. 2 peaks, but so close together that it's not clear whether this counts as 2 mountains or 1 mountain with a dip in it, sort of like that. Out of context, who cares whether it's 1 mountain or 2, but in this context, a decision is needed by somebody. Go back to Mark's image of magnetic poles exerting different degrees of influence. Someone's asked about an unclear case. If you were in a position where you had to give one verdict or the other and act accordingly, which way would you jump? She responds, I can't possibly answer that in the abstract. It would depend on many details of a particular case. It's one of these antecedents that's far from specific enough. Mark gives a low-key example of this kind of issue. He's talking about a paint shop that puts red paints on one shelf and orange paints on the next. Relevant to the way they are divided is the length of the shelves. If the shelves had been different length, they might have arranged them a bit differently. And of course, there'll be more complex cases regarding medical treatment, legal judgments, etc. She continues, but the closer to clearly true, the more likely it is that in specific circumstances I would jump in favour of a positive answer when circumstances demand a decision. So that's a general way in which counterfactual judgments line up with vagueness. The closer to clearly true, when a yes-no answer is called for, the more likely I would go for the yes answer. Mark in his writings makes a lot of the idea that in unclear cases, either decision is permissible. And I agree that in an unclear case, when an on-off decision is required, there may well be circumstances in which a positive verdict is called for and circumstances in which a negative verdict is called for. But I want to put more emphasis on the fact that the closer to clearly true, the more fitting is a positive decision. And I believe it's degree of closeness to a clear case which enables us to solve the Sorites. So the general lesson is we need less on-off thinking and more or less thinking, even in the context of deduction, to understand uncertainty, vagueness, and indeterminacy. And in my view, probability is our best tool for understanding the more or less thinking. Thank you very much.